We are so glad to have you here. My name is Paul Edwards, and I am the director of the Wheatley Institution here at Brigham Young University. And I'd like to welcome you to our 2021 annual Truman G. Madsen Lecture on Eternal Man. We're delighted to welcome Rabbi Dr. Meir Soloveichik as this year's lecturer. I have asked Brother Ahmed Corbett, counselor in the Young Men General Presidency, to introduce tonight's speaker. Brother Corbett grew up in New Jersey, just outside of Philadelphia. As he talked about in his recent General Conference talk, he joined the church as a teenager, received an undergraduate degree in New Jersey at Richard Stockton College and a law degree from Rutgers University. In addition to his work as an attorney, Brother Corbett has a distinguished career in communications and public affairs in the private sector, and also, and I first met Brother Corbett when he was doing this for the church. He directed the church's public affairs in New York City. He currently works in the church's missionary department. His church service includes his time as a full-time missionary, and then also as a stake president and president of the Dominican Republic Santo Domingo East Mission. He and his wife Jane, sorry Jane can't be with us this evening, but they have 6 children. And anyway, could you please provide a warm BYU welcome to Brother Ahmed Corbett? Thank you, brother.
Paul Edwards, thank you for your excellent and elegant leadership of the Wheatley, as director of the Wheatley Institution. We never get to give him a round of applause. Would you join me? Thank you, Paul. Rabbi Dr. Meir Yaakov Soloveichik is truly one of the luminaries of the United States, the West, and beyond. My description, not his. Indeed, his supplied biography was so truncated and modest, I thought that since I've known him for years as Solly, I could get away with protracting it a bit, including some brief anecdotes. He is the director of the Zahava and Moshael Strauss Center for Torah and Western Thought and an assistant professor of Judaic Studies at Yeshiva University. I was fortunate to have Solly tour me through this prestigious institution in uptown Manhattan. I imagine it is to the Orthodox Jewish community what this university, established just 11 years earlier in 1875, is to Latter-day Saints. Rabbi Soloveichik's research and teaching interests are amazingly diverse, including Jewish theology, philosophy of religion, the American founding, wartime ethics, bioethics, and Jewish-Christian relations. His essays and articles have been published in a variety of outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, Mosaic, First Things, Commentary, The Forward, and Azure. He was awarded the Beckett Fund's 2018 Canterbury Medal for Religious Liberty. It was on this occasion, the occasion of President Dallin H. Oaks's receipt of that award in 2013 in New York, that I had the personal privilege of introducing these 2 eventual awardees of that great honor. Rabbi Soloveichik received rabbinic ordination from the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary of Yeshiva University and a PhD from Princeton. He previously served as the resident scholar of the Jewish Center in Manhattan. He is married to Lealisa Soloveichik, and they also have 6 children. Solly and Lealisa are members of the oldest Jewish congregation in America, Congregation Shearith, Israel. Previously, he was associate rabbi of Congregation Kehilath Jeshurun, affectionately known by many of us as KJ. I conclude with this point for two reasons, one somber and the other festive. This synagogue suffered a devastating fire in 2011. We were gladdened to hear that, fortunately, no one was endangered and none of the Torah scrolls were in the building at the time. On the festive note, it was there 15 months later where Sally hosted my wife Jane and me at Sukkah service. Sukkah, or Sukkot, commemorates the years the children of Israel, the Jews, spent in the desert on their way to the Promised Land. Jane and I felt true meaning and unity sitting under that makeshift desert tabernacle or booth with you and your family that day, Sally. It reminded me of Psalm 133, Chine matavum manayim shevet achim gam yachad. How good and how pleasant it is for brothers to sit together in unity. On behalf of the Wheatley Institution and the leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, brother, welcome to the desert. Thank you for sitting with us in unity.
Ahmed, that was really amazing and incredibly gracious. It would have been nice if you also said something about my humility, but maybe next time. I'll just add, just to second what a blessing your friendship has been. And I remember after that fire, how church leadership reached out and Elder Cook reached out, and I know it meant so much to the senior rabbi, Rabbi Luchstein, and to me, that our friends in faith were with us at that time. And so thank you for everything. And thank you to all of you for coming. It's absolutely wonderful to be here. Can everybody hear me? Yeah? Excellent. Okay. I have five boys and a girl, so I'm used to yelling, so if I need to, we can. But just want to make sure everybody hears me. First, what an absolute privilege it is to be here at the Wheatley Institution, and what a joy it is to be back in BYU. I've been here several times, and when I first came here, I was so impressed with the school and what's been created here that when Rabbi Ari Berman took the helm as the new president of Yeshiva University, one of the first things that I said to him was, we need to come to Provo together to learn from this institution formed by its faith. And so we did. We had a wonderful meeting with the president, and just want to put it down here as a marker that he promised I could sit in his box at the various sports games when I come next time. Just, we've got that on video now. That's can't back down. But we speak about that visit to this day. I'm so honored to have my friend Elder Cook here in the audience, and to have the joy of sitting with right next to him at our meal this evening. It was our unforgettable trip to Israel that we took together that inspired my talk today. And it's a particular privilege to deliver a lecture that's named in memory of Truman Madsen. It was a joy when last I spoke here to get to know Emily Truman's daughter and to hear about Truman's legacy. And then, after I was honored with the invitation to deliver the Madsen's lecture, I began to read about Truman Madsen. And I learned that aside from his role as a revered scholar, Truman Madsen lived a life that was profoundly linked to the Holy Land and to Jerusalem. And I learned that not only did he serve as the director of BYU's Near Eastern Studies Institute on Mount Scopus in Jerusalem, where we had that unforgettable trip, but that even before that, before he took on this position, Madsen had already led 27 study tours of the Holy Land, including, as I learned from Emily, right around the Six-Day War. So his dedication to traveling to Israel was serious. That's a serious dedication. And what he embodies, therefore, is a relationship with the Holy Land rooted in the biblical vision. That's at the heart of his legacy. And so I'm so honored to be here with the Madsen family to speak in his memory. And, of course, in his own recognition of the miracles that have occurred in the Holy Land and the sanctity that resides there, Truman Madsen was following in the footsteps of one of his predecessors in faith, which is Orson Hyde, a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, who around 180 years ago, more on that number later, journeyed to the Holy Land and prayed for the Jewish return and for the rebuilding of Jerusalem. I therefore thought that it would be appropriate to discuss in this Madsen lecture the biblical and theological meaning of Jerusalem, the unique relationship that many non-Jewish Americans have with Jerusalem, and what the miracle of a resurrected Jewish Jerusalem means for the future of faith. And so I begin in 1871, when William Seward, Abraham Lincoln's former Secretary of State and his most trusted friend, sailed to the Holy Land. On the boat, several passengers caught his eye. The memoir of his trip, which is, I think, compiled or co-authored or edited with his son, tells us the following. This is the book. As we sat on the deck of our steamer, coming from Alexandria to Jaffa, we remarked on a family whom we supposed to be Germans. It consisted of a plainly dressed man with a wife who was ill and 2 children, one of them an infant in its cradle. The sufferings of the sick woman and her effort to maintain a cheerful hope interested us. The husband, seeing this, addressed us in English. He was an American Jew, Seward further explains in a later passage. He had come from New Orleans, and he was going to Jerusalem. So these were American Jews traveling in 1871 with a sick mother. Why? Seward explained that this woman was engaged in a pilgrimage while she was ill because she was preparing to die, and she hoped to make it to the land of her ancestors in time to be interred on the Mount of Olives, overlooking the Temple Mount. It is from the Mount of Olives that, according to Zechariah, at least one part of the end times would unfold, and it was toward this site that Jews sojourned throughout the centuries in order to be buried. And Seward concludes by telling us that, quote, "We parted with them on the steamer. The day after we reached the holy city, we learned that the poor woman had climbed the mountain with her husband and children and arrived the day after us. She died immediately and so achieved the design of her pilgrimage." It's astounding, ladies and gentlemen. A Jewish woman living in Louisiana in the 19th century, mother of small children, suffering from a fatal illness, journeys halfway around the world to be buried on the Mount of Olives, thereby joining her life in death with those buried before. To die this young with a child still in the cradle is, of course, to live a life cut tragically short, but choosing to be buried in a place where so many centuries of Jews had in death exhibited their love of the land of Israel and their faith in its future, that allows her to join her own finite life with Jewish immortality, embodying eternity at the very moment of her own death. And this is a story all the more meaningful to me because 3 of my 4 grandparents are buried on that very mountain. This was Seward's introduction to the Jews of Jerusalem before he even arrived in Jerusalem. And then on his final moments in the city, Seward spent the day watching the Jews of Jerusalem come to the Wailing Wall, one of the remnants of the Temple Mount Plaza, where the Jews would come to mourn for Jerusalem and to pray for its restoration. In those days, if you've been to Israel, this was not the gracious plaza that is there today. It was a tiny, effectively an alleyway. That was all that was allowed by the authorities. I cite several selections from Seward's description of this scene. Quote, this is from him or the book with his son. "Our last day at Jerusalem has been spent, as it ought to have been, among and with the Jews, who were the builders and founders of the city. and who cling the closer to it for its disasters and desolation. For centuries, we do not know how many, the Turkish rulers have allowed the oppressed and exiled Jews the privilege of gathering at the foot of this wall one day in every week and pouring out their lamentations over the fall of their beloved city and praying for its restoration to the Lord. The small rectangular oblong area without roof or canopy serves for the gathering of the whole remnant of the Jewish nation in Jerusalem. Here, whether it rains or shines, they come together at an early hour, old and young, men, women, and little children, the poor and the rich in their best costumes, discordant as the diverse nations from which they come. They are attended by their rabbis, each bringing the carefully preserved and elaborately bound text of the book of the Lamentations of Jeremiah. For many hours they pour forth their complaints, reading and reciting the poetic language of the prophets, beating their hands against the wall, bathing the stones with their kisses and tears. During the several hours while we were spectators of it, there was not one act of irreverence or indifference." End quote. So why, ladies and gentlemen, is this so remarkable? We don't need Seward to tell us that Jerusalem is special to Jews. What's striking about this story is what it tells us about Seward. He gazes with respectful reverence upon the mourning Jews for several hours, disregarding what must have been a Middle Eastern sun. The glory that was the temple had not existed for some time, yet for Seward, it remained that city, the Jerusalem that was, and I think he believes will be again. As an introduction to this section of the memoir, the Seward cite a verse from Ezekiel, which is, "And the name of the city shall be from that day forward, the Lord is here." Meaning, for Seward, so long as Jews still venerate the site where the temple stood, so long as that they believe God still dwells there, then God still dwells there. Jerusalem, Jewish Jerusalem, is for Seward a source of inspiration and of faith. So we have two stories from Seward's sojourn. One which tells us something about Jews, and one about how non-Jews might encounter Jerusalem. One of Seward's anecdotes, the arduous journey and the heartbreaking burial of the Jewish mother on the Mount of Olives, speaks to how Jerusalem was and is a source of longing and unity for the Jewish people, even when exiled and dispersed around the world. But Seward's other story, his reverence for the Jewish connection to Jerusalem, shows us something larger as well, which is that the mysterious metaphysical link between Jews and Jerusalem can inspire and fuel faith far beyond the Jewish people itself. And this means that in Jerusalem we discover a profound particularism, but also a glorious universalism, and indeed that the two go hand in hand. So in order to understand this, we must study two visions of Jerusalem and of the temple, which are different but complementary, meant to be taken in tandem with one another. The first is that of King David, and the second is of his son Solomon. We begin with David. The king of Israel and the successor of Saul was coronated deep within the territory of his own tribe, Judah, in the city of Hebron. But it is soon after taking the throne that David conquers Jerusalem and makes that city his capital. Why? The reason for this move can be discerned from the chapters in the book of Samuel that precede it. After his life was threatened by Saul, after a civil war against Saul's son, which pitted the members of David's own tribe, Judah, against Benjamin, the tribe of his predecessor, David now seeks to bring the 12 tribes of Israel together and to find a way through which to emphasize the metaphysical destiny that unites them. And so here, if you will permit the prosaic example, I will cite the wonderful film Miracle, about one of the most important geopolitical events of our time, which is the victory of the U.S. hockey team in the 1980 Winter Olympics at Lake Placid. Not as important and miraculous as the 2016 World Series victory of the Chicago Cubs. Surely the greatest miracle of our time. But nevertheless important geopolitically and worthy to study. So the coach, Herb Brooks, as some of you may know, basically coaches a bunch of college students who come from Boston, Minnesota, South Dakota, and they've all played against each other. Hockey, I don't have to tell you, is not a placid sport. And so they all hate each other. And they are riven by rivalries because they remember that guy knocked me out, that guy hit me, that guy did this, I'm going to get back at him, and so forth. And so Brooks would work them out on the ice, and he would ask them, who do you play for? And the answer would invariably be something like UMass, South Dakota, I worked for you at the U. Okay. And so he would work them and work them and work them on the ice until the answer to who do you play for is, I play for the United States of America. And Brooks at one point tells them something like, when you put on your uniform, you represent your teammates and your country. And the name on the front is a lot more important than the name on the back. That's what he says. So here in the book of Samuel, David is seeking to avert and overcome literal tribalism between tribes, to teach his subjects that they are all part of God's covenant people, that they are bound together. And that's why he chooses as a new capital the city of Jerusalem, because if you carefully study the book of Joshua, where the Holy Land is divided up amongst the children of Israel, amongst the 12 tribes, you will see that Jerusalem is listed as both part of the territories of Judah, but also of Benjamin, which means that Jerusalem is the only shared city in the land of Israel. And it unites geographically the tribe of David and the tribe of Saul, Judah and Benjamin. And Jerusalem being shared by the tribes of Judah and Benjamin is actually not just prosaic and political, it's sublimely symbolic. Because remember Genesis. After being sold into slavery by his half-brothers, Joseph suddenly stands before them in disguise as the vizier of Egypt. He forces them to bring before them his full brother, Benjamin. And then Joseph frames Benjamin for a crime, telling the others that Benjamin will become a slave. And then, spoiler alert, in a stunning act of repentance, Judah, who had suggested selling Joseph in the first place, now steps forward, shields Benjamin, and says, take me instead. And then Joseph breaks down and forgives his brothers. Meaning in this extraordinary act, Judah's sacrifice for Benjamin exhibited a repentance that united the tribes with Joseph and bound brethren together. And so here, just as once Judah effectively embraced Benjamin in this moment of unity, here in Jerusalem, effectively Judah joins Benjamin. Jerusalem is thus a unique symbiosis of geography and theology, in which a spatial recreation of Judah's penitential sacrifice for his family is replayed out atop a mountain for all eternity. Indeed, according to the Talmud, the altar in the temple, which David builds at the end of the book of Samuel, is built right on the border between Judah and Benjamin. The altar, in other words, i.e. the sacrifices of Israel, is the hinge point between Judah and Benjamin, and therefore between all brothers of Israel. Jerusalem embodies the brotherhood of Israel, and it therefore forever becomes the locus of Jewish longing, uniquely situated in order to embody that we as a people are all family and are called to sacrifice for one another. It's a capital that joins faith and family. That's the allure of Jerusalem. That's how it continued to unite the Jewish people even when they were dispersed around the world. That's how it becomes a city that can even draw a sick mother from New Orleans in the 19th century, or my two grandparents from Chicago in the 21st century, to be buried on the Mount of Olives, overlooking the top of Mount Moriah, where David built an altar and dreamed of crowning the city with a temple. According to Chronicles, that dream was denied, but according to Chronicles, David at the end of his life bequeaths his son Solomon the blueprints of the temple, and Solomon follows them to the letter. There is therefore from Solomon absolutely no creativity in construction of the temple. It's all from his father, as far as it comes to conceiving of the temple's physical form. But in terms of what Jerusalem and the temple are all about, Solomon builds on David's vision, but he also adds something profoundly new. So having discussed David, we now proceed to Solomon. As discussed in the book of Kings, Solomon, miraculously endowed with the wisdom of God, gathers all Israel and Jerusalem to inaugurate the temple after it's been built, and he delivers one of the great speeches in the Bible explaining the theology of Jerusalem for all eternity. The Ark of the Covenant, the throne of God, is brought at Solomon's instructions into the Holy of Holies, and the presence of the Almighty somehow suffuses the structure. And this represents a mystery that Solomon, as smart as he is, cannot solve. How can an infinite Almighty take up permanent residence in Jerusalem and in one house in Jerusalem? And so Solomon begins his speech by remarking at this mystery, as he says, "Will God indeed dwell on earth? Behold, the heaven and heavens cannot contain thee." An infinite God resting his presence atop a finite ark is a miracle that even Solomon cannot explain. And when we think about it, ladies and gentlemen, we realize that again, geography and theology are intertwined, that the mystery of the Temple Mount also, in its own way, embodies the miracle of the Jewish people. Because here we have a universal God who creates the universe, chooses to make his presence known first and foremost in one relatively small site on a relatively small mountain in a relatively small country in the Middle East. And this in turn embodies another surprise, which is that the God of all humanity chooses to be known to the world through one particular family. That the creator of all the earth chooses to be known on earth as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is what some theologians used to call the scandal of Jewish particularity. The scandal of Jewish particularity. As the writer and intellectual Norman Podhoretz once put it, quote, "In wondering about this singling out of one city from among all the tribes of the land from among all the cities of the land of Israel, I find myself in a luck to be led into its larger and even more mysterious context, which is the singling out of one people from among the nations of the world." And the critical question is, how does one react to this scandal? So one succinct summary of the scandal of Jewish particularity, as Podhoretz notes, can be found in the somewhat anti-Semitic words of the British writer William Norman Ewer, who we now know was also a Soviet spy. And he coined just a small bit of poetry, which is, "How odd of God to choose the Jews." How odd of God to choose the Jews. One senses the scintilla of scorn within these words. But for others, including non-Jews of biblical belief, the miracle of the Jewish journey through history can actually inspire not scorn, but awe and even faith. And so instead of how odd of God to choose the Jews, I would substitute, in reflecting on the scandal of Jewish particularity, I would substitute the reflection of another non-Jewish writer, the Southern novelist Walker Percy, who once said as follows, quote, "Where are the Hittites? Why does no one find it remarkable that in most world cities today there are Jews, but not one single Hittite, even though the Hittites had a flourishing civilization while the Jews nearby were a weak and obscure people? When one meets a Jew," writes Walker Percy, "when one meets a Jew in New York or New Orleans or Paris or Melbourne, it is remarkable that no one considers the event remarkable. What are they doing here? But," continues Percy, "it is even more remarkable to wonder, if there are Jews here, why are there not Hittites here? Where are the Hittites? Show me one Hittite in New York City." That's what he writes. Though, given some of the people I've met on the subway in New York City, if they were Hittites, that would explain a lot. But it is true. It is striking. Where are the Hittites? Ahmed recalled the fire that took place at my synagogue when I was the assistant rabbi. I'll just mention as an aside that when this occurred, this was before the High Holy Days, and so we needed a place to conduct High Holy Day services, and we were offered, amazingly, the auditorium in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And so there I went to conduct services at the auditorium in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I went in, in a white coat, which some Jews wear on the High Holy Days, and I was wearing my prayer shawl. All the people coming in New York didn't even look at me. I was probably like the 10th least looking person that they'd seen that day. And as I walked in, this is on the High Holy Days, on Rosh Hashanah, where the whole theme is about God as creator and Lord of history. And they had just gotten a 4,000-year-old statue of a pharaoh, or 3,000-year-old statue of a pharaoh, or something like that, that had been reviewed in the Times as the very essence of regal manhood. And that's what I saw looking at me as I walked in. Pharaoh, as I went in. And all I could think about was this, meaning I'm walking in, I'm going through the Egyptology wing, which I actually enjoy and very much, but I'm just passing kings and empires that had ruled over the world like a colossus and now are gone. And all I could think about on this holiday where we mark God as creator and Lord of history was the poem by Shelley about the statue Ozymandias. Ozymandias was Ramesses II, which some think was the pharaoh of the Exodus, describing similar statue of a pharaoh with the words, "My name is Ozymandias, king of kings. Look upon my words, ye mighty, and despair." And then the poet concludes, "Nothing beside remains round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare. The lone and level sands stretch far away." It's the best Rosh Hashanah of my life. So moving, so faith-filled. So where are the Hittites? Show me one Hittite in New York City. Thus, the presence of infinitude in finite space, of God of all the heavens dwelling in Jerusalem on earth, all this is linked to the miraculous chosenness of the Jewish people. And this can be recognized by and inspire those far beyond the people of Israel itself. And this is what Solomon stresses in his speech. The temple will, of course, be a house of Jewish unity, as his father David dreamed. But in his address, Solomon offers a prayer to God where he adds something radically new, which we do not find in David's words. Solomon says to God, "Moreover, concerning a stranger that is not of thy people Israel, but cometh out of a far country for thy name's sake, for they shall hear of thy great name and of thy strong hand and of thy stretched out arm. When he shall come and pray toward this house, hear thou in heaven thy dwelling place, and do according to all that the stranger calleth to thee for, that all people of the earth may know thy name, to fear thee as do thy people Israel, and that they may know that this house which I have builded is called by thy name." So Solomon, in other words, looks forward to a time when all, not just the Jews, will be inspired by the miracle of a Jewish people and come up and serve God in Jerusalem. So Solomon adds profoundly to David's dream. It is in Jerusalem that the world for Solomon will come to know the miracle that is Israel and thereby come to know the God of Israel. This is Solomon's remarkable vision. Not all people becoming Jews, but of all coming to know the Jewish God. It is a great vision. But how does one achieve it? How does one get there? How does one connect the world to Jerusalem? The answer, unfortunately for Solomon, was empire. For the only time in Jewish history, the kingdom of Israel under Solomon oversaw an empire, a superpower with many other states enthralled to it. And the goal for Solomon clearly was not power for power's sake, but it was, as Bible scholars have known, and this is pointed out by a young Bible scholar in Israel by the name of Rabbi Alex Israel, his goal was to draw the world to Jerusalem. And we see at first hints of success. Thus, the queen of a faraway land called Sheba comes to praise the God of Abraham in Jerusalem. But as the Bible and the book of Kings tells us, maintaining an empire for Solomon leads to problematic policies. Heavy taxation for the king's accumulation of funds, maintenance of an enormous amount of horses for cavalry, and most disastrously, the establishment of political alliances through Solomon's marriages to pagan princesses, first and foremost the daughter of Pharaoh. All these acts were forbidden to Israelite kings by the book of Deuteronomy. A Jewish state needs independence. It needs the power to defend itself. But it is meant to impact and inspire the larger world as an empire of ideas. But a Jewish political empire like Solomon's allowed Israel itself to be impacted by the pagans, from whom the Bible called it to remain apart. Solomon's vision of the world coming to know the God of Jerusalem was far-reaching. His mistake was how he sought to reach this goal. One's reminded here of a line in the Steven Spielberg movie Lincoln, where the president, Lincoln, was saying that it's not enough to have goals. It's not enough to have a vision. That's obviously important. But you have to know how to get there. And Lincoln recalls working as a surveyor, and he says, "A compass, I learned when I was surveying, it'll point you true north from where you're standing. But it's got no advice about the swamps and deserts and chasms that you'll encounter along the way. If in pursuit of your destination, you plunge ahead heedless of obstacles and achieve nothing more than to sink in a swamp, what's the use of knowing true north?" And so Solomon was the smartest man on earth, and he had a profound vision. That was his true north. But he did not avoid the spiritual and moral pitfalls that were in the path of his achieving his goal. We know what happens next. Paganism enters the city, and then as punishment, the 10 northern tribes are taken away from David's kingdom. But Solomon's vision of the miracle of Jewish Jerusalem ultimately inspiring the world, that vision remains. Because one day, as Isaiah proudly proclaims, all the nations of the world will come to Jerusalem, saying, "Come, let us go up to the house of God, to the mountain of God, to the house of the God of Jacob." One day God will be universally acknowledged in Jerusalem, but this universal God will be acclaimed as the God of the house of Jacob, with the particularism and universalism of Jerusalem being joined forever. Thus, these two visions of Jerusalem, of David and Solomon, go hand in hand. a city that is profoundly Jewish, but which, through the miracle that is Jewish history, inspires humanity. But this vision of universalism founded on particularism was not embraced by most of the world for most of the history of Jerusalem. From the Romans to the battles over Jerusalem that followed, empire after empire sought to conquer Jerusalem, claim its universal significance for itself, while denying and often seeking to destroy the Jewish connection to Jerusalem. For some countries, this remains a goal today. Hence, the incredible irony of a structure that sits on First Avenue in New York, across the street from the United Nations General Assembly, a structure known as the Isaiah Wall, because inscribed upon it are the words of the Hebrew prophet that gave it its name. The words are, "They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." These sentences conclude Isaiah's prediction of the end of days, when all the nations of the world, as I just mentioned, will recognize the God of Jacob and join Israel in serving him in Jerusalem. It represents one of the most sweeping and universalistic beliefs in the Bible, but the verse's presence on the Upper East Side adorning the United Nations is a bit of a tragic irony, because it's there, maybe more than most other locations on earth, where over the past many decades, dictators were welcomed, tyrannical nations had been celebrated, and Israel's historic connection to Jerusalem was often denied. The universal vision of Isaiah is celebrated, but its foundation on this wall, the wonder at the miracle of Jewish Jerusalem, that's so often effaced. But if there were those who embraced both the particularism and universalism of Jerusalem, they were to be found first and foremost in America. William Seward's reverence was not unique. He reflected a true feature, a true facet in the history of his country. And in understanding this aspect of America, I turn for a moment to a non-American, a friend of mine that I miss very much, a British Chief Rabbi, Jonathan Sacks, who I think has visited here at the university. Rabbi Sacks passed away last year, and this coming week in the Hebrew calendar is the first anniversary of his passing. Rabbi Sacks once reflected about his first visit to the United States. He grew up in England, went to London, went to Cambridge, then comes to the United States. He says, "I was a student," I'm quoting a few selections from this recount. "I was a student traveling around America on a Greyhound bus. I arrived at dawn on a cloudless day, and for the next 3 hours I walked around the mall, awed by the great monuments. What fascinated me was that each came with its own text. The Lincoln Memorial had the Gettysburg Address on one side, and on the other the Second Inaugural, and so with the others. I suddenly realized," Rabbi Sacks said, that American memorials are not just to be seen, but also to be read. And then Rabbi Sacks said as follows. He said, "It's the exact opposite in London. Go to Parliament Square and you'll see that the memorial to David Lloyd George has just 3 words. David Lloyd George. Benjamin Disraeli gets 2. Benjamin and Disraeli. As for Churchill, he just gets 1. Churchill." Now, Churchill know how to speak English. As Rabbi Sacks notes, you could have some speeches from Churchill on the monument, but you don't. Why? So Rabbi Sacks said, England is a traditional class-based society, I'm quoting him, where things are there because they're there, whereas the United States is that rare phenomenon, a covenant society. Covenant societies represent conscious new beginnings. They are founded on an idea dedicated to a proposition. That's Rabbi Sacks' point. And when I read this from him, I saw this everywhere. Like if you go to DC, you'll see that they sell ties with like the Declaration of Independence on it. No one's selling Magna Carta ties in Heathrow in London. They're selling pictures of the Queen, Buckingham Palace. I have a mug with a picture of Henry VIII and his 6 wives on it, that when you pour hot tea into it, the 6 wives disappear. Things like that. It's a cool mug, but I can't use it on the Sabbath because we're not allowed to erase things on the Sabbath, so not a Sabbath mug. Anyhow, but America is a covenant society, which means it was formed in dedication to an idea. And this is right, and that's why America's founders sought inspiration so often from the original covenant nation. In 1776, a committee of Franklin, Jefferson, and Adams recommended that the seal of the nascent United States should feature Moses and Pharaoh at the Red Sea, with the accompanying motto that referenced not the colonists' liberation, but something much more universal, Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. The founders sought inspiration from biblical Israel's own tale, believing that, like biblical Israel, America's story could change the world. As Rabbi Sachs further put it, quote, "It is no accident that the founders of America turned to the Hebrew Bible, nor that successive presidents have done likewise, because there is no other text in Western literature that draws these themes: history, providence, covenant, responsibility, the need to fight for freedom in every generation, together in a vision that is at once political and spiritual." Rabbi Sachs added that Israel, ancient and modern, and the United States are the two supreme examples of societies constructed in conscious pursuit of an idea. And I would add to this that perhaps the most striking example of this phenomenon is a speech by Lincoln, who recalled learning as a child about the American Revolution. And he said, I recollect thinking then, boy even though I was, that there must have been something more than common that those men struggled for. That's something even more than national independence. That's something that held out a great promise to all the people of the world to all time to come. And Lincoln added, I am exceedingly anxious that this union, the Constitution, and the liberties of the people shall be perpetuated in accordance with the original idea for which that struggle was made. And, Lincoln ended, I shall be most happy indeed if I shall be a humble instrument in the hands of the Almighty and of this, his almost chosen people, for perpetuating the object of that great struggle. Almost chosen people is a very fascinating phrase. What it means, I think, is that America doesn't seek to supplant or secede or to supplant or supersede biblical Israel. Rather, it is biblical Israel's imitator. It learns from the lesson of the Hebraic story. And if the Jews found a remarkable home in America, it's because, at least in part, because America, from its beginning, found biblical Israel a remarkable and inspirational people. And if America became modern Israel's best friend, it's because America saw therein a parallel to its own story. So, William Seward making the arduous journey in 1871 in order to be inspired by the land and by Jerusalem was a profoundly American endeavor, and he was not alone. Many Americans journeyed to the Holy Land, including a ship filled with pilgrims to the land in 1867. Along the ride on that trip was a journalist by the name of Samuel Clemens, later famous as Mark Twain, though he did not really share the devotion of the other members making this trip. And his biting wit was made manifest in his memoir of the journey, Innocents Abroad, which addresses what was for him the anticlimactic nature of the Holy Land. And he mocks, at times, the faith of his fellow travelers. Twain describes how he was astonished how the land of milk and honey, when he got there, was agriculturally desolate. Because of the role it plays in Christian scripture, many of the travelers, understandably, were very excited to stand at the shores of the Sea of Galilee. But Twain gets there and he says he's astonished at how pathetic it seems. He says, I've been to Lake Tahoe. This is not Lake Tahoe. And so when it came to the most sacred site in the Holy Land, Twain was shocked that he saw nothing about the beauty described in the Bible. He writes that, quote, there was hardly a tree or a shrub anywhere. Even the olive and the cactus, those fast friends of a worthless soil, had almost deserted the country. No landscape existed as more tiresome to the eye than that which bounds the approaches to Jerusalem. That's Twain. But as many have noted, including Rabbi Moshe Tarragon in an interesting article, many have noted this, I think, that Twain may have missed something important, which is that indeed the land was desolate, but this desolation was predicted and was part of the miracle of the land. Exactly 600 years before Twain's trip, in 1267, a famous rabbi by the name of Moses ben Nachman, or Nachmanides, saw the same desolation, but he argued that that was part of the plan. He writes, from the moment we left, the abundance of the land has failed to show itself. And this, he believed, was a fulfillment of the promise in Leviticus that during the exile, the land will remain desolate. Or, as he saw it, the land was waiting for the Jewish return. And upon the Jewish return, the land would flourish again. Twain failed to understand this. But, ladies and gentlemen, there is someone else who knew what Nachmanides knew. Orson Hyde saw it because he sensed something profound about the promise of Jerusalem, its balance of particular and universal, and therefore what Jerusalem proclaims about the future. I have to confess that when this trip with Elder Cook was first pitched to me, and I'm going to make a terrible confession here at this speech, I didn't know anything about Orson Hyde. And I know, I'm a humble person, as Ahmed failed to mention, but still, I know a lot about American history. So I thought, this is an obscure person, nobody Jewish is going to know about him. And so we go to Israel, and we go in to have a private meeting with then Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and we explain that we're commemorating the 175th anniversary of Orson Hyde's visit to Jerusalem. And without missing a beat, and Elder Cook will vouch for this too. I mean, rabbis might make up stories because they're good stories, but Elder Cook will vouch for this. He says, without missing a beat, he goes, "Oh yes, Orson Hyde, I wrote about him in my book." And I'm like, no way. And so as soon as we get out of there, I Google book. Absolutely. It's exactly what he did. And he has a book about Zionism and the history of Zionism. And Netanyahu is he describes Orson Hyde's visit, member of the Quorum of the 12, to Jerusalem in 1841. He describes it as an important event in itself, and as part of the story for Netanyahu of American special relationship with the Hebrew Bible and with the Holy Land. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the anniversary of Orson Hyde's visit to Jerusalem is this Sunday, October 24th, exactly 180 years ago. After a long visit from America, a long journey from America, he stood on the Mount of Olives and prayed. This is part of what he said. "Remove the barrenness and sterility of this land, and let springs of living water break forth to water its thirsty soil. Let the vine and olive produce in their strength, and the fig tree bloom and flourish. Let the land become abundantly fruitful when possessed by its rightful heirs." And then he also adds, "Thou, O Lord, did once move upon the heart of Cyrus to show favor unto Jerusalem and her children. Do thou now also be pleased to inspire the hearts of kings and the powers of the earth to look with a friendly eye towards this place, and with a desire to see thy righteous purposes executed in relation thereto. Let them know that it is thy good pleasure to restore the kingdom unto Israel, raise up Jerusalem as its capital, and constitute her people a distinct nation and government." 1841, or as Netanyahu writes, decades before the first Zionist Congress. In the past 70 years, much of what Nachmanides promised, what Twain's fellow travelers might have somehow sensed, and what Orson Hyde prayed for, has come to pass. Some of Isaiah's prophecies about the Holy Land have been fulfilled in our time. God has consoled Zion, as Isaiah says, consoled its ruins. He has made its desert into an Eden and its wilderness into a garden of God. To walk in Jerusalem, a Jewish city once again, to see Hebrew everywhere, to see the city expanded far beyond its walls, is to ponder in the best way the scandal, if you will, of Jewish particularity, to wonder at the resurrection that it embodies, to marvel at the relationship of an infinite God with one small site in the Middle East. And it is this miracle that has inspired so many beyond the Jewish people itself in our time. Precisely because in an America once so rooted in the Bible, so many Americans seem to have forgotten the Bible. Precisely because secularism or neo-paganism seems so central to popular culture. Precisely because biblical faith is so often derided and denied. Therefore, for those that still embrace the biblical worldview, the marvel of resurrected Jewish Jerusalem often provides and embodies one of the best arguments for faith itself. And therefore it now serves for so many non-Jews in America and around the world as a biblical beacon. My friend Eric Cohn once put it this way, quote, "Jerusalem, the ancient holy city reborn, stands for many as the city of hope, the spiritual center of a Western renewal anchored in the Hebraic moral system. In dark times, and religious Christians surely believe we are living in dark moral times, Jerusalem renews and rekindles the spirit. The improbable Jewish story, the resurrection of Jerusalem, a broken bone come together, set and growing again, provides perhaps the most compelling grounds for believing that good in the end will indeed ultimately triumph over evil. For without God's election of the Jews, the biblical vision of human life as sanctified under commandment, courageously defended, might never have come into being. Jerusalem," writes Eric, "forever the Jews' city of hope, and once again the West's, is now the emblem of our shared purpose to work with faith, political will, and moral resolve to rescue and defend our shared heritage from destruction and decay." Eric is right. And it's this love for Jewish Jerusalem exhibited by so many that provides us with what I believe is one of the other wonders of our otherwise very troubling age. We still live in an unredeemed age. Events predicted by the prophets, some have come to be. But unlike the fully foreseen age of Isaiah, swords have not yet been beaten into plowshares. And we can add, if we reference the next verse in Isaiah, the next verses, the wolf does not yet lie down with the lamb. One is reminded here of the Jewish joke in which a man visits a zoo and to his astonishment comes upon a cage that contains both a wolf and a lamb. So the amazed man goes over to the zookeeper and says, "It's incredible. This is exactly as Isaiah has predicted. The end times are upon us. The wolf lies down with the lamb." I'm quoting this. I must have seen this somewhere. He says, "The wolf is lying down with the lamb. How have you brought this about?" And the zookeeper says, "Very simple. Every day we put in another lamb." So the Isaiah eschatological age is not here. But there are wonders in our time, not only in Israel, but in the larger biblically inspired world. Indeed, a wonder that from the Jewish perspective we have never seen before. Because I can say as a student of the Hebrew Bible that Jews can now encounter an event that has not occurred before in our history, which is that many millions of non-Jews around the world care deeply for Jewish Jerusalem, seek to protect Jewish Jerusalem, and draw profound inspiration for their own faith from Jewish Jerusalem. That means that we are closer to the joining of David and Solomon's vision of Jerusalem. And this, in spite of all the challenges we face, is, I believe, a historical fact that, speaking as a Jew, we Jews are only starting to fully seek to understand. But one thing is clear. If throughout the world there are those who seek inspiration from Jewish Jerusalem and devoutly desire its preservation, then we as Jews must respond with a central Jewish virtue, which is gratitude, and a hope that the inspiration of Jerusalem can help revitalize the link between America and the Bible once again. Upon the liberation of Europe, several rabbis and Jewish scholars asked the leaders of the American armed forces in Europe after World War II for help in publishing a copy of the Talmud. That's the vast corpus of Jewish law and lore, so that the Jews in DP camps who had survived the Holocaust could once again study the Torah and the law of God that they loved so much. So one might have expected the army to say no. After all, they were there to liberate Europe, not go into the Jewish book business. But amazingly, the army agreed. And so they requisitioned a printing plant in Heidelberg, which during the war had printed Nazi propaganda. And in 1948, 2 years later, it published 500 sets of what is today known as the U.S. Army Talmud, marking the only time, as far as I know, in the history of the Jewish people that a national government published an edition of the Jewish law, highlighting how America has, at some extraordinary moments, shown a reverence for Judaism, unlike any other country in our diaspora experience. The Talmud's preface contains the work's only words of English, and it's one of the most beautiful expressions of gratitude that I've ever seen. And it reads as follows. This edition of the Talmud is dedicated to the United States Army. The army played a major role in the rescue of the Jewish people from total annihilation, and their defeat of Hitler bore the major burden of sustaining the DPs of Jewish faith. This special edition of the Talmud, published in the very land where but a short time ago everything Jewish and of Jewish inspiration was anathema, will remain a symbol of the indestructibility of the Torah. Where are the Hittites? And then it concludes, the Jewish DPs will never forget the generous impulses and the unprecedented humanitarianism of the American forces to whom they owe so much. The story and the Talmud, because I own one of those sets, or my synagogue does. I borrow it. But the story captures both the miracle of Jewish endurance, the bond between America and the Jewish miracle. And it also highlights the obligation of Jewish gratitude to all that seek to bless the children of Abraham. Today, enemies of Israel remain, but so do its friends. Standing on the Mount of Olives, the site of so much Jewish yearning, Orson Hyde also prayed as follows: let that nation or that people who shall take an active part in behalf of Abraham's children and in the raising up of Jerusalem find favor in thy sight. To this I add, Amen. And may we continue to find a bond together in marveling at all that Jerusalem is and at all that it is yet to be. Thank you very much.